have my good friend and mentor, the thinker, James the Thinker Smith, on here. Guy changed my life with my internship at Pitt when he just decided to very eloquently motherfuck me up and down and let me know how much I did not know on our first encounter. And I've been in his pocket ever since. James, thank you so much. We are so grateful for you coming on to the podcast and sharing with us your knowledge, your expertise, and whatever wisdom you could put on us, man. We really appreciate you.
Thanks for having me on.
Okay, so my first question. I had just texted you this question too, and I had heard you speak on another podcast. It was the what was Mark Bell's, the name of Mark Bell's podcast? The Power podcast?
Power Project, yeah.
Yeah, and you guys were discussing the limbic system, and you compared the amygdala and the frontal cortex to a seesaw. And I had asked you, I said, is it like a seesaw where it's more like an energy system where the higher the heart rate goes, the more inclined you are to utilize glucose as your source of energy versus fat? Or is it an agonist-antagonist relationship where the second you switch on that limbic system, that frontal cortex is just see you later? Because I know for me, one of the hardest things for me to do is once I'm pissed off, it's either one or the other. There's no in between for me. Can you elaborate on that?
I use the seesaw or the teeter-totter analogy for a colloquial purpose, in that for all intents and purposes, it's accurate. In a technical description, it might be more accurate to describe it somewhat similarly to the relationship between parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system, in that it's not quite accurate to describe them as being opposites. Fundamentally, one of the more compelling theories regards a general cortical network in describing consciousness at a mechanism level, and how the interpretation of information, let's say, is processed by way of many areas of the brain cooperating with each other in ways that historically the description was more localized regionally. And so as it regards the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex, they are physically connected by a white matter tract. And so that describes the relationship on each of the other's ability to affect the other, such that if you are in a calm, focused, rational state of mind, and you were to interpret some piece of information in a way that triggered an emotional response, that could then tip the servers, if you will, towards the less rational, and vice versa, in that this is why many of the coping mechanisms that are well substantiated in the research share in common the stimulation of analytical thinking, such that the influence from areas of the prefrontal cortex can have on down-regulating the output of the amygdala. And so for all intents and purposes, it is effective, in my view, to use the seesaw analogy, such that, and perhaps even more so, to make clear that the amygdala's largest role is in fear processing. And many of the negative emotional outcomes that most people struggle with in the realms of anxiety-based, fear-based, having a front of mind access to worrying or being concerned about things. These are all emergent from activity that not exclusively, but in a large part has to do with output from the amygdala. And what is key in my view is for everyone to understand, hence, as I was describing off camera, the reason for my virtual background here, that operating at psychological baseline is within everyone's capacity due to the brain's ability to adapt, of which the mechanism is described by neuroplasticity, which we can discuss if you like. But yes, SeeSaw is effective to use for those stated reasons.
So when someone is in that state, it best serves that person to not be in that state when you need to problem solve. I know when I'm playing chess and I'm sitting there and I'm on a bicycle, just on a stationary bike alone, the elevation in my heart rate, it reduces my cognitive process. It's insane. I can't, the second I get on the bike, I lose my first game, almost without a doubt. It doesn't matter what level person I'm playing against. I make stupid mistakes. And then it takes about 5-10 minutes for my body to stabilize, for that to be my new norm, in order for me to actually play chess accurately while exercising. Or I shouldn't say accurately, but more efficiently while exercising. Is there, other than like a cognitive behavioral therapy, where I think the one thing, or I feel the one thing, and then I think myself through that process, how does this best serve me? Why do I think about this? What do I do about that? And how can I go from this step to this step? What would you recommend for someone to do in order to work themselves back into that state, into a more parasympathetic state where they can process more effectively?
The way that I look at that, Mike, is by first understanding the mechanism of how these states arise in the first place. And one of the biggest misconceptions that I see and have seen in, just broadly speaking, the therapeutic domain is that these, let's call them maladaptive states that people find themselves in, that describe the reasons why they're going to some form of therapy in the first place, on the surface level, one would think that the perception is that these maladaptive states are just states that are common, that happen to many people at one time or another. People who are more afflicted by them, it happens more often. And it's viewed as if, as far as I can tell, something that is just a fact of the matter, that is perceived as something for which there are various strategies to mitigate, as opposed to something that simply doesn't have to happen in the first place.
Yes.
Right. And so that's what I'll speak towards both of those points, because everyone is familiar with the fallacy of only being focused on treating symptoms across a variety of medical domains, for example, in that, yes, it's important to understand triage, for example, in order to solve for something that's life-threatening in the acute sense. However, to only understand triage, or even extending beyond that, longer-term care after the fact, in the absence of injury prevention or otherwise health compromise prevention, is missing what is arguably the most important knowledge one can have. So as it regards the psychological, the maladaptive thinking and behavioral afflictions that individuals have, the preventative care there is understanding the power of interpretation. So I'll speak towards that, and then we'll go to, well, what to do if it already happens. All emotional states of affect, which in the clinical terminology for feeling, any state of feeling that an individual has that is negative, which tends to be the only one that's a problem, apart from something like a perpetual manic state, which would not be useful either. Any negative feeling is one that arose as a result of an interpretation that was negative of some aspect of the world, including thoughts that occur in one's mind. Now, based upon each individual's default mode or default network of what they have automated in this regard, that's what must be discussed in order to determine whether the interpretation lied more in the conscious realm or the unconscious realm. So with that, in practical language, if someone finds themselves in a state of negative emotion, the first question would be, were they or are they aware of what led to it? There's a difference between, man, I was thinking about something that my significant other said to me in an argument the other day, and I can just feel myself getting angry about it as I sit here, and one thing led to another. Well, then that would be an awareness of the negative interpretation, even though they probably don't realize that they could have interpreted it otherwise, and that's where the power comes in. An alternate example might be someone, say, who's walking down the street and they're overcome by a terrible feeling, and they cannot make heads or tails from what precipitated it. It's as if it came out of nowhere. Now, the former, in which the awareness is there as to the stimuli, that's simply a lack of knowledge in regards to how that stimuli is open to be interpreted otherwise, which leads us to another misconception, which is that much of the world operates under the opinion, because it's well, it could be knowledge, because there's bad knowledge, that facts equal reactions.
What do you mean by that? Facts equal reactions.
This is the misconception that, in my view, plagues most of humanity. So a fact would be something that happens in the world that can be consensus agreed on as being real, but I also allow that term to cover a thought that a person has that is not outwardly observable, but one that we might say, okay, I'll take your word for it. You had that thought, and that's what led to a cascade of, say, negative thought loops. So no matter what it is that precipitates a reaction, if we allow ourselves, for just agreed upon language purposes, to say, okay, we'll call that a fact. We'll say that it happened, so that what's easier to understand as being factual is things that we can agree happened. Like there's fact. There's a situation going on in Afghanistan right now that is not favorable towards women. Fact. The situation that happened to George Floyd was a form of murder. Fact. There is a great disparity between the fringes of the political spectrum in the United States. Fact. And so these are statements that, no matter what one's opinion is, it is extremely difficult to conclude anything other than that's a factual statement. It happened. It's happening. It's real. It exists. Using those examples, most of the world, I would be confident in stating, is operating under the misconception that the situation in Afghanistan, that the political situation in the US, that what happened to George Floyd, and going on and on with different factual examples, most of the world is operating under the worldview that those events are, and then we fill in adjectives such that what's happening in Afghanistan is an atrocity towards women. What happened to George Floyd was a crime against humanity, was an outrage. What's happening with the political spectrum in the US is an embarrassment. That these types of subjective statements are in fact one of a near infinite amount of interpretations that could be made, because on their own, these events have absolutely no significance. Significance, the concept of it, is one that is manifested in the mind of each person who interprets it. As difficult as that would be for someone who attaches an enormous amount of significance to women's rights and equal opportunity and, centrist, reasonable interpretations of politics, as offended as someone might be who attaches a high degree of significance to any particular subject, to hear someone like myself say, there's nothing at all significant about that, until one assigns the significance. That might be difficult to grapple with. However, that is the truth. That is why, and we can go through a near infinite amount of examples of how this manifests in the world. That is why you have one person who will pay hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars for a baseball or an American football that has a signature of this is an analogy I've used more than once, of a famous player, whereas someone else looks at that same ball and interprets it as, look, I don't care whose name is on it. I can buy that for $5 at a garage sale. This idiot over here just paid $200,000 because it's got this Hall of Famer signature on it. That's an example of it. It just comes down to interpretation. So much of what explains at the mechanistic level the problems that exist between humans is in fact arbitrary. It's made up. They're concepts that are fabricated that then have significance attached to them. Okay. So that lies more in the conscious realm. And as you know, there's rarely a short response out of me, Mike. So let me know if any of that was unclear. In terms of the unconscious, the individual who finds themselves overcome with a feeling and they can't make sense of how it happened. This too is a product of an interpretation, but one that is happening at the unconscious level. David Deutsch has a very compelling theory of the three types of theories that manifest within a human mind, from the explicit to the inexplicit to the unconscious. Briefly, what he describes, explicit theories or ideas are ones that we possess the explanatory knowledge for in the real time as they're happening, something that we can use our language to describe. And inexplicit theory might be one where in the moment we lack either the time / opportunity to utilize explicit knowledge to describe what we were thinking, for example, but after the fact we can. And so, Mike, you'll make sense of this, an example of in your baseball playing career, there was times where you can remember being at bat and having swung on a certain pitch where in the moment, it wasn't feasible for you to explain yourself verbally why you elected to swing at that pitch. Afterwards, however, you could. Unconscious, by definition, being, in this case, in David's idea, unconscious theories being those that exist where knowledge is being manifest, but we have no conscious connection to it. Hence unconscious. And in his concept, any discrepancy between two or more of those theory-based centers is what one interprets as a negative feeling. So an asymmetry between explicit and inexplicit, an asymmetry between explicit and unconscious, and you can go round and round. And I think that's a very compelling theory. Nevertheless, any negative feeling that one has, and they are lacking the knowledge to explain why they have it, must be understood as something that on some level, evidently unconscious in this case, is emergent of a negative interpretation or association. Mm-hmm. And the good example of how that might make sense to someone who's not otherwise convinced is one of the most longitudinal research studies that was done on post-traumatic stress followed the Vietnam War, in which a fair amount of study went into the dream states of individuals in combat. And this trend emerged in which they found, and this generalizes to anyone who's been traumatized for any reason, it does not have to be warfare based. The trend was an individual who has an experience that results in trauma will quite likely, in short order, begin to have violent dreams, which can manifest in a variety of ways. And those violent dreams will abate over time. They diminish over time. So this is an excellent example of how the conscious experience influences the unconscious cachet of ideas. This is somewhat of a, I'm not quoting anyone here. I've developed this theory of my own in that if you can imagine an individual who is not psychologically prepared and is someone who has borne witness to or been the recipient of events, notice that I'm being careful to speak neutrally, events that were, in this individual's case, unconsciously or consciously interpreted as being negative, horrifying, hurtful, painful. We can use as many adjectives as we want. That individual starts building up a catalog of negative associations of thinking as they replay and recall that event or those events. And that begins to add up, in my theory, at the unconscious level. And if one is compelled by Deutsch's theory of the inexplicit, the explicit, and the unconscious, one will understand the mechanism of how the unconscious can influence the conscious. And this is an example of what's happening with dreams. The reason why the dreams are more violent, closer in proximity to the event that precipitated them, is explained by the influence of the conscious experience on the unconscious, because it's the unconscious that is in the driver's seat when we are dreaming. And the reason why then that would abate over time is because of the reconciliation that is allowed for over time in working through these experiences that people have, the events that they have, processing them, intellectualizing them. In either case, the conscious or the unconscious interpretation must be understood in terms of the agency that anyone has on reinterpreting. So this is why I say it is essential to understand the front end. In the medical context, let's understand what causes heart disease. Let us not only focus our attention on how to treat it, let's focus on what causes it. So, would it be helpful if less people were obese? Unquestionably less, yes, right? This is not an opinion. Would it be helpful if more people suffered less psychological stress? Unquestionably, yes. Would it help if more people had lower blood pressure? Unquestionably, yes. There's no situation in which the medical community would say, no. If only more people were more obese, not only would their well-being be increased, but so would the healthcare system and all the rest. Just as no one would say, no. We need to have an ample amount of distress in our lives. And in fact, the more chronic distress one can experience, the better they'll be for it, right? That's an asinine statement. And so we have that knowledge. Ironically, whether or not the knowledge is possessed in certain circles, it's clear enough to anybody walking around the street that it's not as commonly understood as it could be, which is the agency each individual has on how they interpret the world. And given that agency, this opens the door to how one can live a life at baseline, in which equanimity is the default mode. The other half of your question, Mike, was what to do if you're already in that state. So if it's already happening, this is what's more well understood in the therapeutic community, coping strategies. And as I stated earlier, the ones that have some of the highest support in the literature, affect labeling, cognitive reappraisal, distraction, these have been well studied. The reason why they are effective is because what they share in common is the stimulation of the prefrontal cortex. Let me know if you want me to expound on that, or I know I was just on the podium for a while speaking there. So,
Brooker, you were going to say something.
I was going to say something, but then when you was talking about the labeling of the event, let's say, and you were saying that one of the things that causes harm is this negative interpretation of it, sort of like the narrative amongst it. My first question was going to be, is it just as unhelpful to try to reinterpret the event as a positive or a meaningful event? Is that just like two sides of the same coin? Is it almost better to just keep it to the fact? Or is the reinterpretation, is it better to kind of sway it into, well, what is the positive of this and how could this be beneficial and meaningful to me?
I hasten to apply my personal opinion, Alex, in that I don't view it rational for me to ascribe the one way everybody should, I avoid normative statements. However,
Of course.
I think it makes the most sense to interpret most everything factually, as you stated, neutrally, in which case one remains at or close to baseline equanimity, because another theory of mine is I describe as emotional physics, in which case emotional potential behaves like a sine wave. So if you imagine this flat line behind me as being 0 and the amplitude of a curve above it or below it, in the case of a sine wave, that amplitude is the same. So the peak deviation from 0 is the same in both directions. And I view emotion to be an analog of this, in that the emotional capacity a person has describes particularly or specifically how high they go in that distance, in this case above baseline, is matched by the distance below in terms of how low they can go. So the person who experiences an outwardly observable, let's say, reaction to joy, whatever the strength of that positive reaction is, in my theory, is going to be the same strength, but in the other direction when they interpret something negatively. So that joy of the newborn baby and the strength of that joy is most likely going to be matched by the same magnitude of grief if that baby dies the following day.
Sure.
And we can map that onto any other experience, no matter the strength of it, how high the magnitude of strength or how low, that something equivalent to that in the other direction will be of the same strength, just in the other direction. And so this is why I advocate for equanimity, which is the balanced state of mind that is unaffected by pain, emotions, and that which causes one to lose the balance of their mind. The state of composure. This is one that I view to make the most sense for anyone, for the reason that the best of our knowledge and skills are most accessible to us when we are at baseline or slightly aroused. As you'll be aware of, there is, reaction speed is something that can be enhanced if we're slightly aroused, certain reflex actions, but the devil is in the details. Slight levels of arousal, so that's not a generality that could be mapped onto everybody. You need to be 3% aroused. That doesn't exist as far as is understood. And so that's why I advocate for neutrality, simply because if someone conditioned themselves to only positive, that then brings the question, how might they behave inappropriately if, say, they were at a funeral and somehow they had conditioned themselves to find that hilarious when somebody dies. And in one context, we could say, well, that's better than grieving. Whereas in another context, that's rude to do if you're standing there at the funeral next to the person who lost a loved one. And so, it's more of an extreme example, but my opinion is that neutrality is what benefits everyone the same.
So essentially what you're saying is the higher the high, the lower the low in those circumstances. But what do you think of more of a maximal output versus operational output standpoint, whereas the rising tide raises all ships, right? Where I can get myself to the point where I'm extreme, because you could do this during depression, where there's no such thing as happiness when you're depressed, right? It's only really depressed, and fuck, I want to kill myself. So now there's also the manic side, which I still think that there's a relatively healthy side of that where things will not bring me down. I will find the positive in things and still live a very healthy life. So when, for example, when I first met my now wife, I was very nervous because I had never been so happy before. I mean, I would hug her and experience extreme joy. Like I was elated. I've never felt this before. It was so amazing. But in the back of my head, that terrified me because I felt this extreme joy. I know I'm going to be so fucking miserable. God forbid something happens, right? To lose this feeling, it's terrifying, right? But at the same time, maybe it can just elevate me and keep me in a better state of mind more consistently rather than the up and downs. What do you think of that?
Yes. Well, what you have described is accurate in that the perspective in this case, using the maximal versus operational, that as the perspective grows, the awareness grows, then along with that, so can the reframing of everything else become neutralized. That's one way of looking at it. The way that you've described it, Mike, okay. First of all, each individual must be looked at individually, right? In me and Alex speaking a moment ago, that's generalizations. And so if we're talking about you and you recognize yourself as someone who has higher highs and lower lows, there's a greater dynamic range that exists there. Then in the case, okay, it begins with your interest. What are you most interested in? Or if I generalize this, someone who recognizes that they're more emotionally volatile in terms of the capacity of their highs and their lows, the first question is, does the idea of equanimity interest you? Because all knowledge follows interest. From the epistemological lens, anyone can become and develop the knowledge that anyone else ever has developed in any subject matter. There's no limitation on a particular individual in developing the knowledge. The most pertinent question is, are you interested in developing this knowledge? And so that's the first one. And Mike, I've just in my own anecdotal experience, I have had conversations with people who have said, I don't like the idea of always being at equanimity. Like I like how it feels to be really high, and when I'm that low, I just, I feel my way through it and I'm better for it on the outcome, et cetera. It comes down to if you're interested. If you're interested and you're coming from, if we use a spectrum in which we're speaking specifically about the neuroticism component, which is the seat of all negative emotion, as you're familiar with. So if neuroticism is on one end and equanimity is on the other, well, then we can localize the discussion to where does each one of us exist on that spectrum currently? Are we closer to equanimity, closer to pure neuroticism, somewhere in the middle? So anyone who's farther away from equanimity, Mike, will find more logical understanding in what you hear me talking about, but the practical accessibility might seem like it's so far away, which means someone might say, listen, what you're saying makes sense. Like I don't hear you contradicting yourself. It makes sense. But in terms of me being able to achieve that just seems like it's so far away. I don't know that I could ever achieve that. That's what happens with many people who are farther away on that spectrum. Someone who's already more even-keeled in terms of their disposition, it makes more sense to, because they're already a great way there on their own, say implicitly. And so that's important to recognize. If the interest is there, Mike, then what is involved is in principle no different than the development of any other skill. When you consider the, whatever, if you want to look at it as the phases of motor learning, anything, it always begins with a great deal of conscious effort. And then you pass through those phases, and the outcome of it, if mastery is achieved, it's no longer a conscious effort. It's automatic. It's your new default mode. All skill shares this in common, skill development. Anyone operating at a masterful level in a sport technical activity, in the musical domain, in the dance domain, in painting, drawing, what have you, shares in common, if they are an expert, shares in common an unconscious level of exceptional ability. And no one was unconsciously an expert when they first started. No one. It takes time. It takes a great deal of conscious effort initially into what may then transcend into an unconscious domain at a high stage of mastery. And it's no different with the psychological, that my answer is, okay, if anybody wants to develop this ability to exist in a state of equanimity, the way that you do it, it's going to demand, particularly the farther you are away from it when you start, a great deal of conscious effort directed towards the type of what I refer to as psychological preparation, which is essentially thinking exercises. And once enough of those high quality repetitions are accumulated, only then does the conscious directive then begin to shift towards the unconscious. But in principle, it's the same as any skill. Anyone who's excellent at a skill already knows how to do this. It's just in the psychological context, what has to be repeated, at least my conjectures on what must be repeated are, that's what I consult on in terms of the different types of psychological exercises.
I like how you say equanimity now, instead of going more towards on the scale of sociopathy.
Well, it just so happens to be that an individual who is, say, high in trait psychopathy is, on balance, more likely to possess, of the many behavioral attributes, immunity to stress. Immunity to stress, psychological stress, particularly of the chronic type, which is unequivocally unhealthy, is something that benefits everyone universally. Immunity to stress. It goes back to interpretation. No matter what happens, you do not experience psychological distress as a result of that event. That's something that benefits everyone unequivocally. And it just so happens to be that someone who is high in trait psychopathy possesses that. On balance, this is true for individuals of that sort. And that's one example, depending upon which literature you're referencing. These terms are not clinical diagnoses, psychopath, sociopath. These are not clinical diagnoses. They describe behaviors. The current accepted terms in the literature is antisocial personality disorder, which has various subtypes. But one of the key features, one of the feature that's important to pay attention to, is this concept of stress immunity, and how no matter what the criticisms may be that one would direct towards someone who, say, is high in trait psychopathy, particularly if that behavioral trait characteristic is directed towards hurting other people, right? Because there's many people who are high in trait psychopathy who are no threat to humanity. it has an enormous amount to do with how those people were treated when they were young. So that's kind of an aside, but that's important to reference, that just because someone is high in trait psychopathy does not mean that they are a serial killer or a threat to humanity. It simply means that they will have a, fearless dominance and immunity to stress and the capacity to manipulate others along with other traits. However, whether or not those are used to cause harm to others is a question that must be understood as being highly individual to each person, not something that's generalizable. But it's the stress immunity that's important to recognize, and everyone can work towards possessing that.
So when I was looking through the Novasind website, and there was a lot of mentioning about this, a focus on building a greater immunity to stress. Now, in the process of sort of developing this skill, do you break it down like the typical clinician? So like an ABC model: affect, behavior, and cognition. And are you kind of sort of educating people or providing different like theoretical knowledge and also exercises amongst to go with it? Or is it very much based on just understand like true depth, the true depth of understanding? Because I also know that a lot of the times when you do come to a level of understanding, it's almost like a click rather than something that you almost have to work towards. Does that make sense?
It does. And my answer is a bit of both, in that the mobile application that my team developed for me consists of both concepts and methods, in which the concepts, this is all explanatory, it's my voice on the mobile application. The concepts cover the conceptual explanations, and the methods are my suggestions for how to practice these. That's the mobile application. The way that the process works at the executive level, which is what this began with, is me consulting in person, often via Zoom, as we're having this discussion now, with, for example, a chief executive officer for a set number of times, followed by another series of consults like this with the executive team or the C-suite. And then the mobile application was developed in order to reach every member of the organization, so as to give sort of the next best opportunity to assimilate the knowledge that the top executives of the organization are receiving, that can be shared throughout an organization. And then there's also another technological piece in there as well that allows for the identification and correction of errors across an organization, which is based upon the knowledge gained from the consulting and the mobile application. But yes, as you stated, learning by way of rote memory is highly inefficient from the standpoint of developing explanatory knowledge. And for that reason, Mike will be familiar with this, I generally am repelled from the idea of fixed systems, lists, parameters, follow these steps and then do the next thing. I have an aversion to those because of the way that they restrict the idea of the growth of knowledge. And so therefore, in my consulting, there's a heavy emphasis on conceptual explanation. However, I don't just leave it with the abstract explanation, and that's where the methods come into place in terms of ways that anyone can practically apply these concepts. And it's begun with the executive community, and I have in the works systems of consulting for military special operations and law enforcement. And so that's what the future holds.
One of the things you had said was it benefits everyone. to not have psychological stress. It's across, just like it benefits everyone not to be obese. Now,
particularly of the chronic sort, it's
right.
It's important to me to make that distinction.
So my thought is that's very fair. And I was going to ask the comparison of inoculation versus avoidance, where inoculation is small doses over time. And what does that do? That builds your resilience, whether it's progressive overload in the weight room or stress resilience components associated with psychological behaviors. Now, that's completely on the other side, where I can get a little bit of stress every single day and I'm blah to it. That's one way to create equanimity, is to consistently expose yourself to that chronic stress. That way, eventually, it becomes part of your normal life and it doesn't even bother you anymore. Or do you think it's better to not even register, to teach someone to not even register it as stress in the first place? What's the difference between the two?
The latter is a wiser choice, simply because if what you described in the former, Mike, is essentially desensitization, right? And that does not necessarily mean that, okay, just because one has exposed themselves to a certain event a certain amount of times, that it no longer leads to the same type of reaction within them. Well, what we want to look at in terms of how might we compare these different modes of offering solutions is some ideas of looking at this quantitatively is, okay, how about time, energy, and what type of psychological distress did you experience along the way? When you look at it in those terms, in principle, it is possible, again, this is in principle, that someone in one conversation, as it regards interpretation and other aspects of the discussion, one conversation might be all it takes for them to have a complete reframing of their worldview. They could walk out of that conversation utterly changed. The type of exposure, I mean, exposure therapy in part consists of what you described, exposing yourself to a little bit and then a little bit more and then a little bit more. However, it's not only the exposure, it's the explanatory knowledge along with that. I use the arachnophobia as an example, someone who's deathly afraid of spiders. Exposure therapy for someone who's afraid of spiders would in part consist of the incremental, the scaled, the gradual exposure to spiders in ways that were very accessible at first, maybe one spider and it's on the other side of the room and it's in a cage. And then you can imagine how that scales either to more spiders or you get closer to it, etc. It's just that it does not only consist of that action. Along with it is the discussion about, okay, this is what is happening here. And we can, go down that line. In the reinterpretation context, Mike, this is something that in principle can have an immediate effect. And so the time that it takes, the type of energy, the potential negative toll of just simply exposing oneself recursively to a given stimuli, void of creating the knowledge that anyone can create to reinterpret it and therefore respond differently. In my view, there's no comparison there. That if it had to be one or the other, then it's always an advantage to utilize the intellectual approach.
So in regards to the spider example, you're still, though you're going through it at the same time, if I have arachnophobia, though we're talking about this and I'm looking at the spider, there is still stress being being exposed to me. Like I am still registering stress because I'm fucking terrified of spiders, right? Like that's an issue for me looking at these things. So even just seeing it is causing an issue. And though we are discussing it and trying to light up the prefrontal cortex instead of the limbic system, having that response and understanding each situation, it doesn't stop the stress from occurring. It merely mitigates it momentarily, in hopes that chronic exposure will lead to diminished effects. But it's still got to be chronic, no?
Well, the answer is it depends.
Yeah.
Right. That we could not generalize in this way, any population and say, this is how it works. In order to specify, what we could have, Mike, is we could have two individuals who are clinically diagnosed with the same pathological condition who respond wildly differently to different approaches, right? And a lot of that, well, it's complex to describe why that may be the case and for what reasons, but one of those may be, and often is, the degree to which they are compelled towards one or the other, right? This is where the placebo effect comes from. This is where the capacity for someone to be more prone to ascribe to faith-based traditions. All of this is explained sort of by the same or similar mechanisms, in that the power of ascribing to a concept and the gravity that holds, right? That is easily, that's what explains why someone might not put up much resistance to wearing a suicide vest and running into a church and detonating it, right? That is explained by a faith-based proposition. We can extend that to any other example where someone commits an act of, say, heroism, the opposite of that. What compelled the firefighters who died in the September 11th attacks to, without hesitation, enter these buildings? What is it that compels a Air Force pararescueman to run into battle with this sole objective of saving the life of a fallen comrade? That all of these in some way share in common the commitment to an idea. So whether it's faith-based or any other, it's what I'm speaking towards here is the significance of committing oneself to an idea. And so now go back to someone who has a pathological condition, arachnophobia or anything else, and ask yourself what type of a difference it could make for an individual so diagnosed if they are sufficiently compelled by an idea, and then coupled with that individual being compelled towards a certain idea, couple that with it being an excellent idea based upon a strong set of explanations and a logical approach. And so that those are the ingredients for a high probability of success, is that high level of commitment to the idea, having been effectively persuaded, in addition to that idea being an excellent one that is substantiated by the strength of its explanations. And so that is something to, seriously consider.
In terms of, there seems like they're like in the process of working with you and your system, there's a huge amount of information to be learned. I mean, and are you also providing people with like different material to read? I know that you're heavily influenced by David Deutsch's work and critical rationalization. Going into also that, how big of an impact has that had on you, and also this whole system that you've developed? Is this kind of the big picture? Because I feel like, oh, you know, people when they're talking about, you know, sports psychology or therapy and stuff like that, they're looking very much at like techniques or hacks and tricks, and it seems like to be very much lower level stuff, as we talked about at the beginning, looking at symptoms. Is the work of David Deutsch, is this more, did this help to give you sort of this bird's eye view over what you're trying to develop here?
That's a very good question, Alex. The answer is yes. That when I'm speaking about psychology, the influences over the years that allowed me to come to the position that I'm in and the way that I consult on psychology are heavily entrenched in epistemology and evolutionary biology, in physics and mathematics. One of the, as it regards the psychological discussion, one of my biggest criticisms towards the field in general is the emphasis on sociological study at the expense of either the reduction or the complete void of epistemological and biological, simply because of the undeniable, profound implications that evolutionary biological understanding and epistemological, particularly the critical rationalism understanding, has on thinking and behavior. You mentioned sports psychology. I don't have a single compliment to direct towards sport psychology. I have nothing but criticisms. And anecdotally, I could share with you, of the professional sport teams that I have or that I currently consult for, 100% of the, again, it's just a n equals 1. I'm just speaking about my own experiences. Every single professional sports team I've consulted for has had a sports psychologist on staff, and every single time the senior leadership down to who I'm thinking of now is not just, you know, certain athletes or certain executives or general managers or head coaches. Take your pick from any one of those from various teams. Every single time Alex has said to me, the person we have on staff has not, you know, I'm making an effort here not to speak diminutively. The short of it, Alex, is that the description has been made clear that what I'm explaining to these organizations is knowledge they've never heard before, despite the fact that they have someone employed to presumably serve that purpose. And so that's an important distinction to be made. And the explanation that I have for that is due to the incredibly limited curricula that explain the mechanism of what leads to the understanding that most people with those psychological credentials have, being incredibly limited. And of course, anyone can develop the knowledge in any area they want, but when we look towards, well, what do these curriculums consist of? What is an individual being required to develop an expert understanding of, and how does that map on to the profession? That's where I'm very comfortable making the criticisms, because what you'll see is an overarch, particularly at the undergraduate level. I would go as far as to say it's embarrassing for anyone who selects psychology as an undergraduate degree, simply because of how wildly missing the mark the curriculum is. Of course, once you get to the PhD level or the PsyD level, depending on what the clinical interests versus research are, then of course you can hone down on any focus area that one wanted conceivably. It's just that broadly speaking, the the answer to your question, I say yes, is because of what I have been able to assimilate from critical rationalism, from David Deutsch, from Karl Popper, from the broad field of evolutionary biology, as well as the hard sciences, which for me, physics and mathematics, have contributed to this aggregate approach that I take. And I'm confident that in part that explains why people tend to respond similarly when I consult with them with some version of they've never heard anything like this before.
For sure. I mean, one of the things I just made a note of this because I would love to ask you, back a long time ago when I consulted with you when I was very young, when I first met Mike, and I remember always being fascinated because you studied music as your undergrad, right? Jazz music. And Mike, I don't know if you know this, but on James's website, he has it's EPIC is the analogy of your system, right? So epistemology, psychology, intellect, and culture. And you say that this system is influenced by the fields of aesthetics, epistemology, physics, mathematics, psychology, military, and gastronomy. Where's the gastronomy influence? What is that about? I'm fascinated.
Yes. There are brilliant minds operating in every conceivable profession. And I've had the pleasure of encountering some of those in the gastronomical realm, chefs. And one of the biggest influences from the gastronomical domain came from the father of Western gastronomy, Auguste Escoffier, the great French chef of the roughly a century ago, who brought to the fore a system of organizing a large kitchen staff at the time in working in the elite hotels of the day, the hotel kitchens, which required a large staff. And he introduced what's referred to as the brigade system, in which case it characterizes a hierarchy of chefs in the kitchen. And it's an excellent example of a concept that I cover in my consulting, referred to as system level optimization, which refers to the optimization of a system and what is necessary in order to optimize a system, according to system level optimization, is an aggregate understanding of each subsystem, how they function synergistically in order to form the system. In the sports context, you're familiar with me using the jargon governing dynamics. This is the same thing. System level. Not having a hole in your understanding regarding a subject matter over which you have responsibility over. That we want a complete understanding running through. And the brigade system is an excellent example of how this works, in that everyone operating in that hierarchy is influenced by a top-down understanding of the final objective. So everything is contextualized clearly at every level of the hierarchy. So it's an excellent example. And I use that as an example in the sports consulting that I do to describe how the reorganization and education and functioning of sports staffs have the opportunity to function by going back 100 years and simply doing what was done in these French kitchens of the day. That, briefly to give the analogy, a commis chef, C-O-M-M-I-S, a commis is someone whose focus is on the preparation of food for a station. That station would be governed by a chef de partie, chef of part of the kitchen. And then this goes on up to a sous chef, a chef de cuisine. It depends upon if it's a French influenced kitchens. These are the French terms. So in this brigade system, that person who's only preparing the food, not cooking it, just preparing the food, cutting the vegetables, for example, is not arbitrarily cutting the vegetables according to their own idea. It's being guided by the influence of the chef de partie, whose ideas are being guided by the sous chef, whose ideas are guided by the chef de cuisine. So everyone is doing their own role, but it's guided by this top-down knowledge. Something that does not exist in sport, because the equivalent of the commis in sport is the strength coach, who, unlike the commis chef, is doing his or her own thing with a complete disparity of knowledge separating the sport coach. So in the kitchen, you have the equivalent of the sport coach influencing the equivalent of the strength coach, such that there's a continuity and a preservation of ideas, a synergy that works up the chain. In sport, you have a wild asymmetry due to the disconnect in knowledge. There's no top-down knowledge. Depending upon the sport, the knowledge top-down ceases at the level of sport coaching, which is a massive problem, maybe one of the biggest problems in sport. But this is an example of how the brigade system can revolutionize sports staffs and any other staff by demonstrating the continuity of knowledge being preserved up and down the entire hierarchy, with only the distinctions manifesting themselves due to the necessary distinctions in terms of the type of work that each individual performs. So that's an example of the gastronomical influence.
Fantastic.
So, James, I promised you an hour. It's been a little over an hour. I thank you so much for your time. Where can everyone find you? Are you releasing Novasind to the public for anyone to download and possibly subscribe to?
It's being talked about. It's being talked about. So what time will tell. If anyone listening to this is operating at the executive level, they can reach me through novasind.com. If anyone listening to this is interested in my consulting on a personal level or a smaller scale level, then they can reach me through multiscon.com. And I can give you might have those already.
We'll put them in the show notes. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's two different companies for two different purposes. Novasind is for the larger scale corporate applications, and multiscon is for smaller scale or individual.
Perfect. James,
Fantastic.
you're the man. Thank you so much, bro.
Thank you, guys.
James.
Cheers.